Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of SMITE Conversations. We're going to be talking about Sylvanus in reference to the last episode where we had a very aggressive Sylvanus, and I wanted to talk about how to properly approach Sylvanus. Now, Sylvanus in the current meta does have some issues, and let's talk about these. First off, anti-healing is more powerful than it ever has been because a lot of anti-healing items give enough additional benefits outside of the anti-healing that Sylvanus' healing isn't really that big of a deal. Second off, Sylvanus is fairly late game, alright? First off, his verdant growth doesn't really reduce protections by a significant amount compared to other protection reductions until rank 5. 5 protections reduced isn't really that big of a deal when you compare him to, say, Guan Yu, who reduces them by like 15 after 3 hits of Talu Assault, or Horus, who, if memory serves, reduces protections by 10 each rank. 5 isn't really a big deal, even in the early game, right? Wisps, protections gained, 10, not that big of a deal, right? Again, I mean, you can get similar levels of protection, but more effectively and more consistently but from, say, Ares' aura, right? Bolster defenses. So his early game isn't that great, especially since once he hits level 15, his passive gives him much more benefit, right? At level 15, his cooldown reduction per seed, these seeds right here, reduces it by 1. If I was not level 15 or higher, that would only reduce my cooldown by a 0.5 second. So Sylvanus just does a lot better in the late game. In fact, there are only 2 specific benefits to Sylvanus in the early game. The first is the fact that his auto attack is an AoE, which really helps with wave clear, which is more important in the early game, right? So this is very useful in the early game for that reason. Not hard hitting. At level 1, his auto attack damage is actually 39, specifically. Let me just show you right here, 39. And with the default protections of minions, that winds up to be about like 34, 35 damage per shot. But of course, you have the multiple hits. Well, you have a hit on multiple targets, so that really racks up. But anyways, that's one benefit. The second is this here plant from Verdant Growth, which just always gives MP5 whenever you're in here, right? That's just a 20 MP5 increase across the board. Now, this is really useful because if you are really paying attention and you're fast enough, because you gotta be picking your items and running to do this fast enough, although there's plenty of time to line up, but people get nervous. But anyways, you run over to this solo lane and you throw one of these plants under their tower, and that's going to give your solo laner some insulation in case the jungler either falls behind or plays badly or just ignores them, right? And they start losing their mana buff. They're still going to have this plant that they can run back to between waves and regenerate their mana and still be able to survive unfortunate incidents a little bit better because they're going to be able to have that source of mana regeneration even if they lose their blue buff. Say, for example, again, I used the example earlier of the jungler just ignoring the lane and their blue buff getting stolen, but if they get the blue buff and then die right afterwards to, say, the enemy jungler ganking, they can have this plant under their tower to fall back on, and they can still sustain some great golden experience gains even without their blue buff. They have to play more cautiously, obviously, because they have to be running back under tower between every wave, and they probably won't be able to box in lane until they get their mana buff back, but at the very least they can clear those waves safely with their abilities because they'll have the mana to do so, even without their mana buff. So this is a great sort of insurance against unfortunate jungler incidents, which is huge in the current meta because right now, one of the most impactful roles in Conquest right now is jungler. I personally argue that it is currently the most impactful role, not by much, but currently it is the most significant role, the most pivotal role in the success or failure of a team in Conquest. So having this does give you some insurance, some insulation against a unfortunate jungling incident. The only thing you really have to do to make this work is just make sure that when you're throwing around other plants that you're not leaving behind more than 3, because the 4th one is just going to delete the first one you put down, which is going to be the solo lane one. And if you hit anything with the plant, it's not going to generate, an actual growth. It's just going to do the root. So you just have to make sure you don't miss, basically. But that's a really great early game benefit of Sylvanus as well, but he really shines in that late game. Now, let's talk about building Sylvanus, right? Now, one quick thing before we talk about building Sylvanus is very interesting in that he has a non-commit initiator. What the hell does that mean? Well, a commit is when you are physically going into the enemy team and starting the fight. That is a commit initiation. Think Sobek, think Athena, right? They have commit initiations. They dash in and they do something. For Athena, she follows that up with a taunt usually. For Sobek, he flings the enemy behind him, right? Those are commit initiations. Sylvanus does not have a commit initiation. His initiation is pulling a single enemy in, right? And this means that Sylvanus spends significantly more time near allies than a commit initiator does, which is the big problem of trying to build some supports as Orobots, right? Because their commit initiation, by nature, brings them into the enemy team and separates the support from their allies, right? So Sobek and Athena aren't necessarily going to be spending a ton of time near allies. They're in the middle of the enemy team. They're setting up kills. The solo laner is usually pretty nearby, right? Because usually the solo laner follows you in. Or they're supposed to anyways. So usually the solo laner will get the benefits of whatever auras a support has. But other allies generally don't get that benefit unless you're either counter-initiating, which means the enemy team initiated first, or you're trying to retreat, or you're trying to save someone's life specifically, in which case that specific ally, and maybe a couple of other nearby ones, will get those benefits, right? But this isn't the case for Sylvanus and other non-commit initiators like Ares. Sylvanus brings the enemy to him so he can be right next to his teammates, pull in a target, and expect them to dogpile, right? Obviously, in the early game, there's not going to be dogpiling because team fighting hasn't started yet, but anyways, because Sylvanus' initiation is non-committal, he's physically near his allies, so auras go a lot farther with Sylvanus than they would with a lot of other supports. So when you're playing Sylvanus, and there are other benefits as well, again, wisps, you have to be near an ally to give them a wisp, and that wisp is going to heal them, and it's going to give them more protections, and we can make that even stronger with certain items, which again lends itself to a later game, benefit than you would normally expect. But nevertheless, Sylvanus spends more time near allies than usual, so when you're building full tank Sylvanus, you're looking very specifically at 3 very specific starter items, which would be War Flag into War Banner, Sentinel's Gift into Sentinel's Embrace, or Benevolence into Heroism. Why these 3? Well, a lot of people really like Heroism. Heroism's really been finally discovered by the player base at large. This is really useful, but for committing or committal initiators like Athena or like Sobek, the only ally who's usually going to benefit from this is going to be the solo lane. Again, you're initiating, so you're in the middle of the enemy team. The solo laner is following you in, so the solo laner is the only one that's going to be consistently within that 55 units, generally speaking, right? But with Sylvanus, being near his allies more consistently, your squishier allies are going to get this benefit more often, which is great because it's going to help keep them alive. It's the same thing with Sentinel's Embrace. Your allies are going to get more of these benefits than they normally would with a committal initiator. Again, committing a committal initiator like Sobek or Athena is going to usually only provide this to the solo lane unless they're trying to save someone specific, right? Finally, if your allies are nearby and you have War Banner, you're going to give them a lot of attack. You're going to give them bonus attack speed, bonus movement speed, which one of these 3 is going to depend on the circumstances. If your allies have a lot of auto attackers, maybe your jungler is Arachne and you've got, of course, the Hunter. Maybe your solo laner is Erlang Shen, something. If there's a lot of auto attackers on your team, you're going to want to go War Banner. If there's a lot of crowd control on the enemy team, you're going to want to go Heroism. If there's not a lot of crowd control on the enemy team and you don't need attack speed, you're going to want to go Sentinel's Embrace. Now, between the three of these, Sentinel's Embrace is actually my least favorite, primarily because you're less likely to get Sentinel's gift benefits because your AoE auto attacks have the unfortunate side effect of tending to accidentally kill a minion or two, which doesn't sound like too big of a deal, but 15 minutes into the match, you're going to notice a difference in your gold, right? So, not my favorite. Sometimes I will still build this if the enemy team just doesn't have crowd control. I don't need to give my allies attack speed, and they just have stupid amounts of damage, like a no-tank composition. Sentinel's Gift into Sentinel's Embrace is going to be very effective, even despite my slight decline in gold. But we're going to, for this example, for a full tank Sylvanus example, we're going to assume Heroism because it's my kind of default, because not all allied teams are going to be needing attack speed, and again, like I said, Sentinel's Embrace has the one mild flaw with Sylvanus considering his AoE auto attack. So we're going to go on ahead and choose Heroism here. Now, the great debate right now in support conversations is Prophetic Cloak or Gauntlet of Thebes. Some people love Gauntlet of Thebes, some people love Prophetic Cloak. For a lot of supports, it really depends on, very specifically, the context. For Sylvanus, it actually doesn't matter. This comes down purely to personal preference. Alright, what do I mean? Well, there's some interesting aspects here. On the one hand, Prophetic Cloak is really easy to stack with Sylvanus. Incredibly easy, because you have these AoE auto attacks, where once you're used to the weird delay on them, is very easy, very consistent to hit targets, and unlike most other supports, who generally speaking are going to have a little bit of a harder time consistently stacking this, you know, they're going to be getting, say, a stack off of an enemy that they weren't initially looking to get a stack on. Say they have a lot of physical stacks and they need to initiate or counter-initiate. They don't necessarily get to choose who they're initiating on or counter-initiating on. If there's only a physical target there, then they're going to get another physical stack, even if they need the magic stacks. This is a little less of a problem for Sylvanus, because without even needing to necessarily initiate, he can throw a single auto attack, grab that stack from whoever he wants, and roll with that, right? So, again, also, we have the ranged auto attacks, which gives Sylvanus really easy ability to, for no mana, grab a quick stack without putting himself at any danger at all. So it's really easy building these stacks. But on the other hand, again, the Prophetic Cloak no longer offers as much, right? You do get the aura, right? Which is really nice. And generally speaking, when I play Sylvanus, I am going to be running Prophetic Cloak because I do like that aura. Alright? You know, you've got the aura there, and then you've got the cloak here. So you've got that aura that you give allies, which is really nice. You also get a similar thing from Gauntlet of Thebes. Again, this is, though, on assists, which is a little harder to grab assists on Sylvanus because he tends to accidentally kill a minion or two. Again, it's not a huge deal. It's not, you know, you're not going to be stealing, like, you're not going to be killing every minion ever, but you are going to occasionally accidentally kill a minion, and it is going to mildly slow down your progress on Gauntlet of Thebes. So for that reason, I generally prefer Prophetic Cloak. If you prefer Gauntlet of Thebes, it is still very effective because you are still, you know, getting that aura and everything, right? Let me, I don't know what I was doing there. I need to sell this. But it comes down to more personal preference, right? Boing. Come on. Oh, it already stacked. So you do get that aura, right? Just the same as Prophetic Cloak. So it's going to come down a little bit to your preference. I do prefer Prophetic Cloak because of how easy it is to build those stacks on Sylvanus compared to his contemporaries. And for the sake of this example, we are going to use Prophetic Cloak as a result of that. But I want you to be aware, Thebes is a good... I didn't buy the cloak. What the heck is wrong with me? Thebes is a good pick here. It's going to, again, come down to your preference. But Prophetic Cloak is a little easier to stack on Sylvanus, and Thebes is a little harder to stack on Sylvanus. And for that reason, I have a mild preference for Prophetic Cloak. Now, what else do we get? Well, assuming the standard composition of 3 physical, 2 magic, I really like to build, fairly obviously, good old Lotus Sickle. Now, this is going to do a couple of things. Now, it's unusual to want to go for such a low protection item as your 3rd item, but there are a number of benefits here. First off, movement speed, which is going to really help you more in the early game when you're going to be needing to rotate a little bit more often. This is going to really help with that. Again, Sylvanus does not have any kind of dash. He does not have any kind of method of moving around quickly, so a little bit of movement speed can really go a long way. He does get a little bit of cooldown reduction, which we now have Prophetic Cloak. We now have Lotus Sickle. That's 20% cooldown reduction. We get a good amount of health here, and this is additional protections for your allies, which early in the game, 10 protections is going to be a decent amount there. Not huge, but you're going to notice a difference, especially in the early to mid-game transition that we're going to be at the time we pick this up. Now, the next thing is, of course, again, 3 physical, 2 magic. We want some magic protections at this particular point. I usually grab Feyblast Hoops. This is going to be 30% cooldowns, which means we pretty much have all the cooldowns we really need. And we also are giving our allies a shield. Now, I'm talking about this after Feyblast Hoops for a very specific reason. These 2 items, Feyblast Hoops and Lotus Sickle, are transitioning your healing, I use that term loosely, from a healing item to a protection and health boosting item, right? You've got the health shield giving them an increase, in their HP. You've got Lotus Sickle increasing their protections. You might be wondering, well, Professor, you talked about Lotus Sickle's 7% movement speed. Why not just get Breastplate of Regrowth? That gives you a burst of 20% move speed and some additional magic power. It also gives you cooldown and a little bit more protections. And you can get this. There are versions of Sylvanus, there are builds with Sylvanus that I do prefer Breastplate of Regrowth, but for full tank Sylvanus, it's more useful to your allies to give them the additional protections, because not only do you have the 10 protections here, right, but you're pretty quickly going to be having the 30 protections here, so you're increasing their protections by 40, which is going to be enough to bring your squishier allies, like your mages, your hunters, your assassins, they're going to go from like around 60 to 70 protections to 100 plus, which is going to give them quite a substantial increase in their durability, because of course that is protections have a cumulative decline in their usefulness. The more protections you have, the less the next protection point means. So for allies who are under 100 protections, boosting them up to that 100 protections is going to give them about 50% damage mitigation on that damage type, roughly speaking. They have the math formula out there. You can absolutely do the math. But it's going to really matter. That matters, right? Breastplate of Regrowth just makes you move faster, which can be really useful for rotating, which is more useful for a solo lane Sylvanus. Alright, if you're a solo lane Sylvanus, because Sylvanus can do solo lane very well, we'll talk about it. But this is more useful for a solo Sylvanus who wants to rotate to mid lane occasionally to wreak havoc. Very useful there. Outside of that, it's actually better to have the consistent 7% move speed, because as a support, you're going to be wandering around a little bit more than you normally would. You're going to want to keep up with your allies, particularly if you've got faster allies like Mercury as your jungler, for example. Or someone with a really great movement ability, or someone who can just really outpace you. For example, Xingwei with her passive can sometimes outpace you. So this consistent 7% move speed boost is going to do you a little bit more good than bursts of 20% movement speed. Alright? And again, the protection increase you give your allies with Lotus Sickle is going to go farther than your movement speed boost with Breastplate of Regrowth. Alright? Now, at this particular point, going for full protection Sylvanus, right? You've got a couple of options. Going back to the physical for a moment here, you have a couple of great choices. Now, again, assuming 3 physical on the enemy team, I'm usually going to grab Sovereignty. This is my usual go-to for a lot of situations, right? We're going to, get ourselves a nice increase in our aura. We're already giving some aura here, right? We get 20. We provide 20 protections here. We have another 15, that's 35 protections on top of any protections they get from our heal. And then I'll usually grab a Delightful Heartward Amulet and go for Amulet of the Stronghold, right? A possibility. You don't necessarily need to. Another great option, if, of course, you're using... This is the option I'll usually go for if I'm running very specifically That's not the one I want. If I'm running the War Flag, I'll actually go for Talisman of Energy to further accentuate that attack speed and that movement speed. Talisman of Energy works really well with War Flag, and if I have War Flag, it's because I have a lot of auto-attacking allies, so I'm going to want to capitalize on that anyways. So I'm also very fond of Talisman of Energy. Again, I like Heart Ward Amulet, generally speaking. That's my usual default is Heart Ward. But Talisman of Energy, if I have War Flag, absolutely fantastic, right? So keep that in mind, be aware of that. That's fantastic. Right? You could alternatively, if the enemy team composition is not that high in damage, you could also theoretically go for, although this isn't really something I do with full tank Sylvanus, you could go Berserker's Shield and then double up on the mitigations with Oni Hunter's Garb. Also very effective if your team is having a really hard time, or you just don't want the auras. Maybe your allies aren't sticking close to you, which happens, and you'll know that by the towards the late game here if your allies are sticking with you. But if your allies for some unholy reason are not sticking near you, Berserker's Shield and Oni Hunter's Garb. I've done this every once in a blue moon. There are just some people who do not group up, right? It just happens. For one or two people who don't group up, you're still going to want the auras because that's just one, maybe two people. But if, like, the whole team is ignoring you, which does occasionally happen, I know any support mains out there know this pain, have felt this pain at least once. But if that happens, Oni Hunter's Garb and Berserker's Shield are going to be much better because, again, Sylvanus is really designed to stick close to his allies, and if there are no allies, you're going to drop dead. So Berserker's Shield and Oni Hunter's Garb will at least help you to some extent with that. But this segues into a really interesting, different conversation. How do we splash damage on Sylvanus? Which is a really interesting burning question. Because you can splash damage on Sylvanus. I mentioned this in the episode with the tanks, with the damaged Sylvanus. You can get away with splashing and damage. Now, the way I don't recommend, but is more useful in solo lane, is you grab the Gilded Arrow starter, which the damaged Sylvanus did do, and then grab, nope, not that one, Diamond Arrow for just a huge increase in your basic attack damage, and this is the only damage you would be building here. And this has a bit more viability right now because it does drastically increase the impact of Sylvanus in the early game. You're looking at some really impressive auto-attack damage numbers from that early to mid-game. This falls off somewhat at the late game, obviously, because enemies are going to have some protections at that time. But it is really, really nice. If you are going with the Gilded Arrow early game start, you are absolutely going to want Prophetic Cloak because you will be actually looking to kill the minion with the gold arrow. Right, so Gauntlet of Thebes is going to be even slower than normal. So if you're running the Gilded Arrow start just so you have that strong early game, do not Thebes. Period. The rest of the build can be exactly the same. If you have Gilded Arrow, by the way, Gilded Arrow into Diamond Arrow, absolutely Berserker's Shield makes for a great option with Talisman of Energy. Even if your allies are actually sticking near you, you can still build these two just fine. Right, that's completely viable. Alright, but you can also go with, instead, you could go for any of these cloaks. That is going to very specifically increase, obviously you're going to get to 40% cooldowns, and it's not my favorite move. Another alternative is Manticore's spikes, because you're going to have the pull, which is going to give you a spike, and then you're going to have the root, which is going to give you a spike, and your ult is also going to generate a spike. So you actually have a decent amount of spike procurement here. Manticore spikes is actually not bad on Sylvanus. It's a little inconsistent, though, in some ways, because you'll actually notice here, where are we? There we go. Nope, that's not it. There we go, Godbots. I was having a really hard time with that for some reason. So we're going to go on ahead and we'll grab Sylvanus for this. Not Sylvanus, Guan Yu. And we're going to boom. And you'll see that the Manticore spike generates from where the enemy was. So it's a little difficult to pick up a spike off of a pull. It's a bit of an issue. Not a huge deal, but if you're looking to splash in some late game damage, Telkine's Ring. Because this has nothing to do with your power. This is just a flat, eventually 70 bonus damage, because that's 10 plus 3 per level, 20 levels, 60 plus 10, 70, right? This is a great late game splash in of power. Okay, now I want to be very specific here. You only will want to potentially build both Gilded Arrow and Telkine's Ring if you're a solo lane Sylvanus. You start and end your build on damage. As a solo laner, that's kind of what you want to be doing anyways a lot of the times. And everything between that is protections, because you still want to be tanky as a solo laner. But for support Sylvanus, even if you want to splash damage, choose one. Telkine's Ring at late, or Gilded Arrow at early. That's down to your preference. Partially, this comes down to your team comp. If you have a lot of early game gods on your team, a lot of ability-based gods, for example, pick the Telkine's Ring. If your team is lacking early game damage, there is a really strong argument for Gilded Arrow as a starter item. But you don't want both unless you're solo Sylvanus. And again, solo Sylvanus will want the Breastplate of Regrowth over the Lotus, right? The Lotus Sickle. You're still going to want Feyblast Hoops because it is going to give you MP5, it is going to give you health, it is going to give that shield to allies, which is great. It's going to drop those flowers, which is absolutely something you want. But for solo lane, instead of Lotus Sickle, you will want Breastplate of Regrowth. But that's really the only serious change. Obviously, of course, again, you wouldn't necessarily want the Prophetic Cloak. You would probably actually start with Breastplate of Regrowth if you have a physical opponent, or possibly you go right into Talisman of Energy if you have a magic opponent. Maybe you don't wind up with the Feyblast Hoops because you don't have that opportunity. Totally fine. Actually, let's talk really quickly about differences for solo lane. Let's go on ahead and leave Telkine's Ring where it is. Again, if we're talking solo lane Sylvanus, we want that at the end. So if you're facing off against a physical opponent, you know they're going to be physical, or you see that they're going to be physical because you didn't buy your second item yet, Breastplate of Regrowth. If magic, you're going to actually want to start with Shogun's Kusari. Now we're going to go on ahead and assume a physical opponent here because that's usually that's the standard. So Breastplate of Regrowth right here. Right, that's going to be fantastic. And then you're going to want some form of dual protections. Again, we have our, let's bring this back down a little bit here. We have our Gilded Arrow for that early game, right? Then we have Breastplate of Regrowth. Absolutely fantastic. And by the way, why Gilded Arrow as a solo lane Sylvanus over, say, Mannequin Scepter, for instance? Which you can use, alright? That's not a bad choice. Actually, Mannequin Scepter is a decent option for solo lane. You can choose either Mannequin Scepter or Gilded Arrow. I prefer Gilded Arrow because it's a little bit more basic attack damage, which is going to go a little farther for the purposes of clearing waves, which Sylvanus has a bit of a harder time with because, again, keep in mind that Verdant Growth is only going to be a large enough AoE to hit 3 minions, generally speaking. Wisps does only 35% of its damage to minions, and Nature's Grasp does nothing to minions. So Sylvanus has a bit of a hard time with wave clear. Mannequin Scepter's burn does help with that, but it's only 10 basic attack damage, and later on this only becomes 50. It does give you the benefit of increased attack speed and physical protections. Gilded Arrow is my personal preference, though, again, just because it gives me higher base attack damage. It gives me that increase in mana and attack speed when I kill the gold minion, right, the Golden Arrow minion. It's just a personal preference. You absolutely can go Mannequin Scepter. Totally viable, alright? But you wouldn't necessarily want to go for, say, Warrior. Well, you could go Warrior's Axe as well if you really wanted to, but you would be really looking to go Animosity late game. My only real issue with this is that Warrior's Axe doesn't really help with your wave clear, which is Sylvanus' bigger problem. So while you can use Warrior's Axe and get a really strong auto attack late game with Animosity, it's really gonna shoot your early game in the foot. So I generally don't recommend Warrior's Axe. It can work. Don't misunderstand me. It can absolutely work. But it's really gonna make your early game very difficult. It's actually the reverse kind of thing with Death's Toll. Death's Toll is great early game because it's going to give you that great healing for each auto attack, and of course you've got the multiple targets here, you're going to get a lot out of this. But whether you go for Death's Embrace, which is going to heal you, but you're going into team fights, so it's going to be less consistent, or you go into Death's Temper, where your basic attack damage isn't high enough to get a huge benefit out of that passive, I also generally don't recommend Death's Temper either, because Death's Temper is really not going to do you that much good in the late game, because you're going to get 50 power out of this. You're generally going to be getting 50 power out of this. That's going to be 100 power, and then you're only going to get 3.5 bonus damage up to 10 stacks, it's still only going to be 35 bonus damage on your auto attacks. It's really not worth it, right? And even then, that's 100 power. That would be assuming you actually got the whole 100 power into your auto attacks. You're only actually getting 20%. So it's actually significantly less. I just want to make sure you understand that this is only 20. You have 100 power off of Death's Temper plus Telkine's Ring. That 100 power only increases your basic attack damage by 20. Okay? So it's like, actually, we can actually do the calculations out here. We grab Death's Temper. We have 88 power here, 3.5 of that. That's not even, you're not even getting 3.5 damage. You're getting slightly under that. You're getting like 3. It's just not worth it at the end, to be really honest. So if you are going solo Sylvanus, Gilded Arrow or Mannequin Scepter, your choice. I prefer Mannequin Scepter only really in those situations where the enemy team has a lot of auto attackers, because it does reduce attack speed, right? Especially Mannequin Mace, which it slows their attack speed by 10%, which is really quite nice. I don't usually go with the Hidden Blade, mostly because it's a little out of control. It's much harder to control who's taking this damage with AoE auto attacks. For a Mannequin Mace, it doesn't matter. They're all going to get burned, which is obviously really significant, and it increases your attack speed. So if the enemy team has a lot of auto attackers, I will go Mannequin Mace, but otherwise, I usually prefer Gilded Arrow into Diamond Arrow. It's going to give me some penetration. It's going to give me some gold. It's going to give me some good gold rates. Generally my preference there. So we're going to, again, for solo Sylvanus, usually like Gilded Arrow, go into Breastplate of Regrowth. Got to get that dual protection item. Again, usually my go-to in this particular situation is going to be Manticore Spikes. Then we need magic protections. This is usually going to be, for me, Talisman of Energy. I like that movement speed. It goes really well with Breastplate of Regrowth. It allows me to rotate a little bit better. If I need to go off and do some solo lane stuff, this is generally going to be really great for that. And then, of course, at this particular point, I'll usually grab one of these two items here. I'll usually grab Spirit Robe or Mantle of Discord. I usually like Spirit Robe because I find the damage mitigation when I get hit by hard CC to be really, really useful. I just find that quite life-saving, so I generally prefer Spirit Robe here, but if you prefer the Mantle of Discord for its stun and its CC immunity when you're near death, and the 10 bonus protections, that's totally fine. I just prefer Spirit Robe, but both work. Then you would get your Telkine's Ring, of course, and then you would finish up with Diamond Arrow. Now, there is one last other thing I want to note here. I mentioned Telkine's Ring is really great because the basic attack bonus damage has nothing to do with your power. It has nothing to do with any of your stats. If the enemy team is absurdly tanky, you can swap that out for Cyclopean Ring. Alright? This is generally going to be something I'm more likely to do on a solo lane Sylvanus, because support Sylvanus isn't going to have a huge amount of attack speed increase unless you're very specifically running War Flag, very specifically, right? But you can. Anytime I've said Telkine's Ring, absolutely you can swap it for a Cyclopean, okay? Just be very aware that Cyclopean and Telkine's are interchangeable depending on the enemy team comp. If they're squishier, Telkine's Ring, which is the usual, again, that's the standard. Enemy support is tanky, enemy solo is tanky. 2 out of 5 isn't generally going to be enough to justify Cyclopean Ring over Telkine's Ring, right? This flat bonus damage is going to do more good against the 3 squishier targets than Cyclopean Ring would be effective against the 2 tankier targets. But if they have they have unusually high amount of tanks, maybe they have an Anubis in the mid lane who is a little tankier than the average mage, Cyclopean Ring is going to really come in clutch there, alright? But that's generally how you will want to be approaching Sylvanus build-wise. Again, notice that I'm really emphasizing the auto attacks because the AoE auto attacks have a lot of potential. Mannequin Scepter for the solo lane. Gilded Arrow for, getting some great bonus damage. Even in team fights in the late game, that can really come in handy sometimes. But that early game wave clear. Maybe you go for the late game. Maybe you're really shooting for that late game because your team members have that early game and they need some late game action. Telkine's Ring or Cyclopean's Ring, right? There's nothing wrong with splashing a single damage item on Sylvanus. Even a support Sylvanus can benefit greatly from a single damage item. It's just a matter of your choice and your team's needs between the early game Gilded Arrow or the late game Telkine's Ring or Cyclopean Ring. That depends on what your team needs. For solo, you get both. You get the Gilded Arrow or the Mannequin's Scepter at the start, and then at the very end you finish up with Cyclopean Ring or Telkine's Ring. The rest of its protections. right? And again, there's going to be an emphasis on enhancing your allies because you're actually going to be near to them a lot of the time, which is really, really a great thing about Sylvanus you can really take advantage of. But again, Sylvanus is having a little bit of problems because he is not that great in the early game. His auto attacks are really great for wave clear in the early game, and the plant can really help your solo lane, but outside of that, a lot of Sylvanus' kit is designed for the late game, which means you are really going to be relying on your allies to carry that late game. Again, you can use Gilded Arrow to help with this, but this is only going to really help with the wave clear and a little bit of damage. So just keep that in mind. And even if you do want to go with a more damaging Sylvanus, look to the attack speed, because you can very easily splash in a combination of attack speed increases and protection increases. You've got Shogun's Kusari, Talisman of Energy, you've got War Flag, Telkine's and Cyclopean Ring both give bonus damage without needing power. Cyclopean's Ring does damage based on their max health. Telkine's is based on your level. Those two are great. Don't have to worry about building power. That's how you should really be approaching. Even if you want to damage Sylvanus, you still should be splashing in protections. You still can benefit from providing protections to allies or yourself and getting attack speed increases. It's very easy. Alright? But with that being said, that's where we're going to end this here. So if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.